Subcommittee on Oversight and Accountability will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the purpose and the priorities of the GEC's operations, as well as provide an opportunity to evaluate whether the work of the GEC and its partners do today aligns with its mission and the U.S. foreign policy. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Let's see here. We'll get there eventually. A lot of procedure in this book. And I always hate sitting up here so far away from you all. Seems very elitist. I think I said that before. We're going to work to sit down there closer to everybody else. So as I mentioned, today, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Accountability will examine the Global Engagement Center, or GEC, and its successes, its failures, and questions about weaponization. GEC's mission statement reads, in part, that it seeks to counter foreign, state, and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts aimed at undermining the stability of the United States, its allies, and partner nations. And we're here today to determine whether or not that mission is being fulfilled. And we look forward to you answering questions about that. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists stormed into Israel with a single goal: inflict as much pain and incite as much horror onto the civilian population as possible. Entire families were burned alive. An unborn baby was cut from its mother's womb. A Holocaust survivor in her wheelchair was dragged out of her home as a hostage. On October 7th, Israel was thrust into a war for its very existence, with rockets launched from Gaza Strip and Hezbollah fighters trading fire on the northern border. Israel is locked in battles on a number of fronts, but the Israeli people are facing another battle worldwide, and that is anti-Semitism and fake news from international institutions and major news outlets, including some in the United States of America. Look no further than the October 17th, when a rocket hit the Al-Ali Arab hospital in Gaza. Almost immediately, the Hamas-run Ministry of Health claimed that it was a gross act of war crimes by Israel that cost 500 civilians their lives. And rather than fact-checking the story, news outlets, including the New York Times and the Associated Press, were entirely willing to take the terrorists' talking points and amplify them to the hundreds of millions of people. Headlines blared that Israel strikes hundreds in hospital. That's what the Palestinians said. But here's the problem. Hamas was lying. And according to preliminary conclusions by our own Pentagon, the explosion was caused by a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket misfire. In fact, mounting evidence even shows that not only was there little to no structural damage done to the hospital, that it was in a parking lot that was hit by debris from the rocket. Outlets like the New York Times did eventually post retractions, but the reputational and political damage was done. Violent protests and riots broke out at our embassies across the region. More protests with liberal hotspots here at home erupted overnight. Hamas leadership called for a global day of rage. Even the president's peacekeeping efforts were halted as a result. Jordanian leadership refused to meet with him because of what was going on with global media and propaganda. Those on the left consistently claim that words can cause violence. Well, here's a very prime example of that prediction coming true. This single example of disinformation led to the condemnation of the United States of America and Israel, and the heightened likelihood of multinational conflict, very real consequences. In my opinion, this story is exactly the type of disinformation the State Department's anti-propaganda body should be focused on countering. But I have questions about whether it saw this coming. Even if we give it the benefit of the doubt and assume that GEC was involved behind the scenes, offering support to the Pentagon and other agencies, the State Department's anti-disinformation apparatus has failed to quickly and publicly counter blatant disinformation. In many cases, this case highlights the problem that I have with GEC, Mr. Kimmage. We know very little about the day-to-day operations. According to an OIG report, GEC's leadership was, quote, able to say, unable to determine whether it was meeting its strategic goals and objective to counter state-sponsored disinformation. We will want answers on that. If GEC isn't countering real-time disinformation that is damaging one of our greatest allies, what is it focused on? A few examples that we can point to seem to form a problematic pattern. GEC has issued grants to organizations that labeled Alexander Hamilton's New York Post one of the riskiest outlets, and another that had a hand in content moderation practices that targeted conservatives online. It's backed, quote, independent fact-checking organizations that are actually supported by left-wing billionaires. In the next year, this committee will decide whether or not GEC should be reauthorized. At this moment, we will determine what the problems are, if there are solutions to fixing any of those problems, and whether this should be reauthorized. The first problem that I see is actually fulfilling your mission to counter disinformation from foreign sources. I don't believe that you've adequately, in your statement, quantified your success in doing so. Second problem that I want addressed: areas where you should be involved and may be perceived not to be involved in this time, as I gave the example of Hamas and Israel. Third place that I have concern: there seem to be some operating in your office that are not as interested in fulfilling the mission statement, but are interested in weaponizing taxpayer resources in order to undercut media outlets and individuals who have a particular point of view. Mr. Kimmage, we've spoken, and I've read your opening statement, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I don't feel that the answers to all of those questions were in the opening statement that you wrote, your letter to us. I need you to convince us that GEC should be reauthorized. I need to hear about how GEC tangibly measures success, how it oversees its partners to ensure that it isn't perpetuating disinformation in other places, and what it does to prevent disastrous foreign propaganda on a daily basis. The onus is on you to change my mind. So I would encourage you to take a moment, think about your opening remarks, as my colleague will be giving his opening remarks, and don't just read us what you wrote to us, but please give us answers to the questions that we have for you so that we can have a very real and true understanding of the work that's being done, whether it's to counter our adversaries like China, Russia, Iran, Hamas, or any other. And in that, I thank you for bearing with me. Let's go back to the script here. I'm now going to recognize my colleague here for an opening statement of however long you choose to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'll spare you all and make this a short one so we can get into the important work of having the discussion that the Chairman outlined. I want to thank you, Mr. Kimmage, for coming here today and offering insights into the very important work of the Global Engagement Center that is doing its part to counter propaganda and disinformation from Iran, China, Russia, and many other adversaries. Your involvement with the Global Engagement Center spans most of its existence, and as such, you have seen the organization evolve as congressional mandates have changed. And I know your testimony will help us understand how the Engagement Center's work strengthens our national security, counters these adversaries' false narratives, and shines light on their malign behaviors. Now, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the unique context in which we hold this hearing. Iran's proxy Hamas has conducted the deadliest terror attack in Israel's history and engaged in extreme brutality against innocent civilians. One of our challenges now is preventing the spread of this terror and this conflict into a broader Middle East war. And a large part of that effort is around countering disinformation and misinformation. At the same time, China continues to undermine peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific and around the world by spreading its malign influence and engaging in provocative behavior against our partners. And Russia's illegal war against the people of Ukraine is now entering its 21st month. In each of these contexts, our adversaries' propaganda machine play a key part in keeping the world divided and obfuscating their true actions and intentions and straining our partnerships and alliances, undermining our policy, our security, and our stability, or those of our partners and allies. And it's an undeniable goal of our adversaries' efforts. The Global Engagement Center, a State Department unit founded by Congress on a bipartisan basis, is one of the tools we use to stem the tide of this disinformation wave. Support for the Global Engagement Center has and continues to be bipartisan, though its current mandate expires at the end of 2024. House and Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans have supported repeated attempts to extend this mandate over the last few years. Any glimpse at news headlines today makes it clear that it is not the time to take an important bipartisan tool to counter authoritarian and terrorist disinformation off the table. There are a handful of critical national security concerns that should be the focus of today's hearing, including Iranian propaganda undermining our security and that of our most important ally in the Middle East, sophisticated information operations by China, which is the pacing threat of our time across the Indo-Pacific, Europe, Africa, and our own backyard. Russia's disinformation campaign propping up its war in Ukraine and aiming to divide the United States from our allies and partners in support of Ukraine. Bipartisan oversight of ways to address foreign malign efforts like these are both possible and necessary. What we should not do with this time is chase conspiracy theories or pursue unsubstantiated allegations that would be counterproductive and undermine our efforts to do this important work. Now, Mr. Kimmage, many of my colleagues will have good, substantive questions about how the Global Engagement Center's work serves U.S. interests, making sure we do our duty, our mutual duty of oversight, and be good stewards of the American taxpayer dollar. So I look forward to your answers on these questions because the American people do need to know what it is you do and why it's important, how we are succeeding, but also ways in which we are falling short, because there's never instances in which any unit, any agency or department fulfills all of its missions. There's always challenges. So let's have a real discussion about what those are and what we can do as members of Congress to help support that mission, which is essential to our mutual interests. So thank you again for your time and for being here today. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have a distinguished witness before us today on this important topic. Mr. Daniel Kimmage is the Principal Deputy Coordinator of the Global Engagement Center. While serving in this role, he has led efforts designed to counter terrorist recruitment and state-sponsored propaganda and disinformation. Your public service career includes a number of State Department positions, including in covering counterterrorism issues for the Office of Policy Planning and as a Principal Deputy Coordinator of the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. I want to thank you for being here today. Got to learn a little bit about you on a conversation this morning. Fluent Arabic speaker, so please don't speak to us in Arabic because we probably won't understand much of what you're saying. But I want to thank you for being here today. Your full statement will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes, but if you're saying really important stuff that we need to hear, I can tell you that I'm not going to cut you off. And after that, we will allow time for member questions. I now recognize you for an opening statement, sir.
Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow, members of the subcommittee, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to testify on the work of the Global Engagement Center. The malign influence of foreign adversaries is a growing threat. It must be an integral part of our national security policy to confront the nations and nefarious actors that seek to undermine our interests and values with information manipulation. The GEC's mission is to lead our government's response to the threat posed by foreign malign influence actors overseas. It starts with coordination. We work closely with our colleagues at the State Department, the White House, the intelligence community, and the Department of Defense to make sure that we use the full spectrum of our capabilities. We engage with allies and like-minded partners to push back effectively against state and non-state actors that want to undermine the way of life that democratic nations have fought to protect and preserve. Recent events have reminded us that terrorism continues to threaten our security. We must remain vigilant to the spread of toxic propaganda by violent extremist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. I'd like to share with you an example of our work on counterterrorism. In 2020, we learned that ISIS Emir al-Mawla had been in U.S. detention. While detained, he provided actionable information about his fellow terrorists. We worked with interagency colleagues to declassify the tactical interrogation reports. We developed a plan to publicize them. We executed the plan, and we tracked the results. We recorded a measurable shift in perceptions as the leader of ISIS lost credibility with some supporters. The State Department's Rewards for Justice program generated a 4-fold increase in priority tips when it referenced the declassified reports. To sum up, the GEC led a successful campaign to discredit the leader of ISIS. Of course, our primary focus is on strategic competition with Russia and the People's Republic of China. Last month, the GEC released the first public U.S. government report detailing the PRC's efforts to reshape the global information environment. Our report starts with a simple premise. Every country has the right to tell its story to the world, but that story must stand or fall on its own merits. The PRC uses deception and coercion to promote its national narrative. Beijing is gaining overt and covert influence over content and platforms. It is constraining global freedom of expression, and it is building a community of digital authoritarians. Our report documents this comprehensively and convincingly. It has garnered worldwide attention since we released it last month. We have every reason to believe that it will inform and embolden our partners and allies as they, too, confront the PRC's aggressive push into the information domain. This tangibly advances America's effort to compete with the PRC. Malign influence is at the core of Russia's national security strategy. President Putin has created a virtual Potemkin village to hoodwink his own people and deceive the rest of the world. We call out this disinformation. We give our partners and allies the tools they need to do the same, and we actively support Ukraine against Russian aggression. In 2020, we publicly exposed a network of proxy media operations, some supported by the Kremlin's security services. Public scrutiny made their lives harder. The editor of one proxy website later described the impact as devastating. Technology is central to the issue of information manipulation. It's part of how our adversaries try to attack us, how we defend ourselves, and how we retake the initiative. GEC IQ is an information sharing and analytics platform with collaborative tools, a centralized data source, and a research library. It links the U.S. government and key international partners so that we can be more effective together. We follow the latest vulnerabilities and opportunities associated with artificial intelligence. We hold tech challenges to find and support innovators. Most recently, we did this last month in Côte d'Ivoire. The GEC is the only part of the U.S. government with a congressional mandate to lead U.S. efforts to counter foreign propaganda and disinformation abroad. It has had its current mission for a little more than 5 years. It has had some growing pains, but it has also had real successes, as I've noted here and look forward to explaining in greater detail in this hearing. We must ensure that the United States does not fall behind our adversaries and competitors as they seek to manipulate the global information environment for corrupt and coercive purposes. There is no substitute for Congress's continued support for the GEC and its mission. We are eager to build on what we've achieved as we safeguard our nation's security and advance its interests. Thank you again for this opportunity. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. One of the GEC's focus areas, as you spoke about, I think all of us have spoken about so far, is extremist terrorist groups. And let's continue to use the Israel-Hamas-Palestinian conflict as the example. In advance of this, was GEC working to produce products to counter to perceive that Hamas might conduct such disinformation campaigns like what we saw with the hospital, or to counter such disinformation campaigns like what we've seen with the hospital under any attack that might take place or propaganda campaign that might take place?
So the Global Engagement Center for years has tracked extremist organizations like Hamas and how they seek to distort events, to promote their narrative.
Can I pause you a second?
Sure.
When you say like Hamas,
Yeah.
do you mean terrorist-like organizations, or are you literally saying Hamas?
I mean, designated violent extremist organizations, including Hamas. Our primary
Thank you.
focus has
Including
been
Hamas.
including Hamas. Our primary focus has been on ISIS and Al Qaeda. We have looked at these groups, how they try to manipulate the information environment to advance their narrative. What are the tools and techniques they use? What are the platforms they use? What are the specific campaigns that they use? Now, we are not an intelligence organization, so we're not part of the intelligence community looking at what groups are going to plan, but we do have a broad familiarity with the types of techniques that they use. We have worked with partners for years to give them the tools to push back against those narratives. We have, in the broader context of Iranian proxy organizations and of Iran's disinformation and propaganda, we have worked to expose the divisive and destructive influence of Iran in the region, and particularly for Arabic-speaking target audiences.
So is that a yes, you do have a Hamas product that we could read?
I don't know that we have a specific Hamas product that you can read. I will ask our analytics and research folks to go back through their reports to see if there is anything. We have been, since the beginning of this crisis, doing daily monitoring. We have been producing both contributions to the State Department's situation reports. We have produced a spot report. We are working closely with our colleagues in the interagency, including the Department of Defense, in the intelligence community, and we have shifted resources so that we can use cutting-edge technology to identify the best approaches to undermining Hamas's specific narratives in the region.
And from my understanding previously and from our conversation earlier, which you, thankfully, I appreciate you educating me on some things I didn't know, helping clear things up in part. You work through a number of third-party organizations. It's fair to call those grant recipients. Would that be a fair characterization of them?
Sure. Some of them receive grants. We work with third parties because the U.S. government is almost never the most credible or effective communicator with the target audiences we need to reach. So yes, we use grants, but we can also provide technical training. We can provide sort of networking experience to link different partners. Grants are only one of the tools in the toolbox, but we work very broadly with partners because that's, in the end, the most effective way for us to get to the countering part of our mission.
What's your budget for third-party organization funding?
Our budget for third-party organization funding has been roughly 30% or so of our $60 million budget. It is more in fiscal year 23 because of money we received through the Ukraine supplemental. And so it's in the, I would say, low tens of millions across the board, and I'd be happy to get you specific figures.
Have you given us a list of the third-party organizations that you work through?
I don't know that we've provided a full list, but we'd be more than happy to provide more information in a closed setting. Let me just be clear that we're dealing with adversaries like Russia, like Iran, that have very aggressively targeted critics of those regimes. We need to be mindful of the security of our partners. They're operating in dangerous conditions in some cases. So we'd be very happy to sit down and go into more significant detail on our partnerships in a closed setting.
Very good. I'm going to yield to my colleague, Mr. Crow, here for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Kimmage. Can you tell me, in the time that you've been with the Global Engagement Center, well, let's actually narrow the time down a little bit. Let's not say the whole time. Let's just say in the last 2 years, how has the information environment changed?
Thank you. The information environment is always becoming more dynamic. The information environment most recently has been, I would say, rocked by advances in artificial intelligence. That's something that we track very closely. It's the reason we have a very active technology engagement program. But what I would really flag in the last 2 years is an increasing alignment among the main adversaries, what I would call sort of the axis of blame America first. So if we look at Russia, Iran, and the People's Republic of China, they all share an objective of undermining and weakening the United States, of reducing our global prestige, of, broadly speaking, blaming America first in every crisis. They often have similar narratives. We initially saw this in the global pandemic. We have seen this in Russia's aggression on Ukraine. And more recently, in the last 2 weeks, we have seen this in the crisis in the Middle East. Where
So an increase in coordination between Russia, China, and Iran on these messages?
I would be careful with the word coordination because it's not entirely clear what is happening behind the scenes, but we certainly are seeing alignment of messages and messaging. We're seeing alignment of some of their platforms. The PRC has invested billions of dollars in global media properties. Russia has a very extensive network, not just of state-funded media, but also proxies, troll farms, various mechanisms for influencing the information environment. Iran has its own smaller but very active ecosystem. We have seen—
Can you tell me, I'm going to move along here.
Yeah.
Can you tell me on the AI front,
Yep.
whether the engagement center is structured and resourced, it has the technology to address that in the way that you would like to, and if not, what do you need to address that effectively?
So we have a very active analytics and research team that is deeply engaged on questions of artificial intelligence. We're looking both at the vulnerabilities that it creates. We're looking at some of the opportunities it may create. We have I would say 2 or 3 people who are focused exclusively on this issue. We are bringing on more people to do this. I think that we are well positioned right now on the issue of AI. We're very well plugged in.
What does that mean?
What I mean by that is that we have people with the right expertise to be looking at the vulnerabilities and opportunities. We're talking to people in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, for example, in the Office of Cyber and Digital Policy in the State Department. So I think we have the right connections and some of the right expertise to be to be involved in this issue. Yes.
Okay. So there's the qualitative element to the information space, but there's the quantitative element. And I travel a lot on these congressional delegations, when we visit embassies, when we visit foreign partners. Across the board, they all tell us that they're just getting overwhelmed in the information space, just quantitatively, that sometimes it's 20 to 1 in terms of the messaging. Can you just very briefly describe the quantitative overwhelming challenge that we face and how we address that?
So here, if I said we're relatively well positioned in terms of expertise in artificial intelligence, we also are dealing with a deluge of information. We are coping with the enormous amounts of output from the propaganda mechanisms of Russia, the PRC, and others. So there is the output, there is the data piece of this to understand how the environment is being shaped by others. I would say that we are also coping with this. It is an enormous challenge because you have both the dynamism of the environment and the volume of the information. So yes, you have identified one of the primary challenges we face.
So I have this test that I call the bar stool test. When we're talking about complicated issues, I pretend that I'm sitting at a bar stool with a beer, telling one of my friends who has no idea what's happening in Washington, D.C. and government, and explaining to him or her what's going on. So imagine yourself sitting at a bar stool now with your beverage of choice, and that person says, what would happen if the Global Engagement Center does not become reauthorized?
Sure. So you've got People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, all of these countries trying to misrepresent us, distort our values, present America as the villain in every circumstance. They're out there working every day. There are thousands of people, billions of dollars going to blame America first and make us seem like the villain. We are leading the charge on our side to make them less effective, to tell the truth about our story, to increase our global prestige and standing, so that we can advance all of our interests in the ways that maintain our standard of life, that allow us to sit here and have this beer in freedom and relative security. So if we go away, all of those enemies are going to have that much easier a time presenting us as the villain, making our job harder in our foreign policy, making it harder to advance America's interests.
Thank you, and thank you for the additional time, Chairman.
Like me, many of your friends are Rangers, so I have no doubt you have a lot of barstool conversations. So
That we do.
that's right. I yield to my friend from Florida, Mr. Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pick up on what my colleague was asking in your response. You said that you wanted to ensure that you were re-engaged and refunded so that you could stop presenting our foreign policy in a failed way. That in my, just that on the surface sounds so funny to me, because when you have things like botched Afghan withdrawals, when you have every other nation who has been able to get their citizens out of Israel, and we were one of the last, actually we were the last, to be able to even get a plane on the ground to try and help them. When you look at unfreezing $6 billion that helped to, even if they want to claim that it was being held by a mediator, it was still fungible income that could be moved from bucket to bucket, that allows not just, and again, I agree with one of the key things, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, that geopolitical alignment in itself is focused primarily on the West, and their overarching goal is to stop developing nations from being able to trust that we'll actually be there when the time is needed. But we're doing that on our own. We're giving them all of the messaging and ammunition that they need. And the only way we're going to counter that is by actually getting good foreign policy and getting a president in the Oval Office who understands that our foreign and domestic policies are intrinsically linked in an effort to try and go ahead and stop the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative, which its entire intent is the Eurasian expansion, the domination of Africa, and to cut off Western Hemisphere supply chain from the Horn of Africa, Mediterranean, Red Sea, Black Sea, Persian Gulf to control those elements, utilize the WHO and the WEF and OPEC to attack the petrodollar and the U.S. dollar as the global currency, while simultaneously utilizing their propaganda and misinformation campaigns in our own hemisphere to go after economic coercion in Panama and Honduras to control the canal, to utilize their marriage of convenience with Russia for the Chavists of Venezuela or Pedro in Colombia, or now as they look into Argentina with what my colleague Maria Salazar has pointed out, a 400 football link satellite that many of the Argentinians don't even know about, and we're not doing anything about. Not to mention the spy and military training base in Cuba, 92 miles off of both myself and Chairman Mast's great state of Florida. So tell me, how is your department going to prevent the president and others from making these failed foreign policy decisions?
So let me draw a distinction between the legitimate debates that we have about foreign policy and the illegitimate misrepresentation of America as a country by our adversaries. Adversaries that seek to paint us as the villain in every situation, that seek to entirely misrepresent everything we stand for and everything they're doing. So, for example, on the Belt and Road Initiative, which the PRC presents as an economic boon to the partners, Global Engagement Center has supported work that shows definitively that the projects that they are funding are not what they're cracked up to be. We've translated that work into local languages. We've done it to make the case with decision-making elites to try to shape the environment in a direction that is accurate, that is true, and that is less conducive to the PRC promoting its interests. So we're not going to solve all of the debates about U.S. foreign policy, but we will continue to try to make progress against these illegitimate, untrue misrepresentations of the United States of what other countries are doing, including in South and Central America, as the PRC tries to make inroads. We're actively engaged in exposing that, in once again trying to influence decision-making elites with a truthful picture so that they can make the right decision on these issues.
Well, when you talk about the economic strongholds where they try to come in and they promise things, for example, that they're going to develop infrastructure and transportation and communication platforms that they know that they're going to control and actually utilize financing back, we don't have to do anything to try and counter them, because usually they fail to complete their packages to begin with, or it's of poor quality, And in most cases, like the country of Iraq as an example, who initially started to go towards that Chinese influence as a result of their relationships of the 2005 constitution that gave sectarian democracy for Iran's stronghold, they're failing to meet every one of the requirements and now looking at the quality of American products and goods again. So again, I'm just trying to kind of talk about one of my colleagues' comments. How does giving more funding to your organization truly in any way help us?
So on the PRC, we have supported work that tracks water levels in the Mekong River Valley, showing that PRC dam projects are harming local agriculture. We supported a dynamic monitor.
But this is an economic resource warfare that we're involved in with China.
Yes.
It's not about just an environmental factor that's being,
I understand.
being complicit in that. My time has expired, and I appreciate your time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And now recognize Ms. Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to that barstool conversation, be sure I understand all this. The way I see it, you are both on the offense and on the defense. On the defense, you are there to discredit other stories about the U.S. or other facts that are not non-facts that are put out. And let me start over. On the offense, you are there to discredit what they're saying. On the defense, you're there to counter the blame America first. Is that accurate?
It is accurate. I would only add that on the defense, we are working with our partners to make them more resilient. So we're doing more than just the communications piece, and I'm happy to detail how we're doing that.
Okay, and also you give targeted information, perhaps like in a country where China or Russia or Iran are trying to influence an election. So you can target that population with a certain set of information about that circumstance. But at the same time you do that targeted information, aren't you trying to influence public opinion at large around the world in some instances?
So we do not seek to influence any outcomes of elections.
Well, I know you don't, but I'm saying countering someone's attempt perhaps to influence an election.
We want to present truthful information or give people the tools so that they have access to that information to safeguard the integrity of a process that depends on it so that people can make an informed choice.
So that's kind of a narrow case, but also don't you do broader information to influence world opinion, for example, like the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, so we have supported in-depth research on the Belt and Road Initiative to expose the falsehoods and misrepresentations that the PRC promotes. But bear in mind also that the Global Engagement Center is part of a larger public diplomacy enterprise at the Department of State that includes exchanges, that includes public affairs, and we also work with our colleagues in international broadcasting who bring objective news and analysis to many environments where that's not otherwise available. We work closely with them because we understand we can't do all the work ourselves. We're focused on this specific issue of propaganda and disinformation, but we're lucky to be part of this broader enterprise, to work with our talented colleagues in helping to ensure information and to give people that broader picture you were talking about.
And would that be like NGOs or Radio Free Europe, those kind of partners? Is that who you work with?
Yes, so international broadcasting includes Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where I was honored to work for several years before I came to the State Department. We also work with NGOs, with non-governmental organizations, with civil society. Yes, we have a very broad range of partners because, as I said earlier, partnerships are absolutely central to our work. There is a small subset of things that we can do on our own, the coordination with other parts of the U.S. government, hearings like this, but to really reach people out in the world so that we can counter the propaganda and disinformation from our adversaries, we need the partners with the right credibility to do that.
You just issued a report on China. You mentioned it briefly. It surprises me that some members of this committee want to kind of kneecap your organization when they're so adamantly anti-China. Would you talk a little bit about some findings of that report and how it's been valuable to us in shaping our diplomacy?
Sure. The China report that we released last month, and it's on the State Department's website, it's available in multiple languages, it details how the PRC is trying to reshape the global engagement environment by using propaganda and censorship, by bringing digital authoritarians together, by gaining control or trying to gain control of international organizations, by trying to co-opt other communicators, and by trying to control the Chinese language media all over the globe. They're doing this to work along kind of three major lines of effort. One is to control content, and it's not trying to be cute here, but it's 3 C's. It's content, constraints, and community. They're trying to insert as much pro-PRC content into the environment as possible. They are trying to constrain freedom of speech, not just inside China, but globally. And they are building a community of authoritarians worldwide. So this report, for the first time, details all of this from the U.S. government. It's from the Global Engagement Center. It's available on the State Department's website, and I would urge everyone to take a look.
I would wager that China is putting a lot more investment into their effort than we are here into your agency to try to counter that.
We and others have assessed that they are spending billions to do all of these things to reshape the global narrative, billions of dollars.
So I don't think we should be shortchanging you in that effort.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Yield to Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the work that you're tasked to do is certainly important and needs to be done, but I have a number of questions that do concern me in your reauthorization. And I guess I'll start off. Would you say that the New York Post is a source of disinformation?
The Global Engagement Center does not do any work domestically, and we don't have any position on any U.S. media outlets at all.
Same with Real Clear Politics?
We simply don't do any work in the United States media.
Same with Daily Wire?
We don't do any work in the U.S. media environment.
Okay, but you did give London-based Global Disinformation Index hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?
Let me be clear about the context here. We had an arrangement with the Global Disinformation Index to do work in 6 languages other than English for a limited period of time to look for Russian and PRC propaganda narratives. It was very specific work. It only went for a few months. It ended at the end of 2021, and that was the end, the beginning and the end of all of our work.
You don't have to get too animated about it. I can tell you there's some concern there, and I just want to dot the I. Would you say that in retrospect it was a mistake to work with them, that they were not, in fact, an index that you would want to use on a go-forward basis?
The work that we did with them was entirely in keeping with the GC's mission to work against foreign propaganda and disinformation in overseas environments. So 6 languages other than English, completely outside the United States, no relation to anything else.
But when you have a disinformation source, one that named those entities as sources of Russian propaganda, then the question is, when you're asking them to give you this, to help you, who's vetting them when you choose to give them money and, in fact, they're a source of disinformation?
Let me be clear about the timeline. The work that we did with the GDI ended at late 2020. I believe the work that you're referring to, with which we had no involvement, was later. It was after, in 2022.
A little more topical then. A few days ago, it was falsely reported that Israeli assets had bombed and killed 500 people at a Gaza hospital. Why is it when you're combating disinformation, your organization is silent as to that false information?
So first of all, the Global Engagement Center is generally not a frontline communicator. We're not the public affairs folks. We have a different mission. We look to make strategic interventions.
Well, what was strategic?
Yeah.
This has echoed around the world. It has both falsely continued to be repeated, even in the halls of Congress by some members. it is currently affecting, because the U.S. is the supplier of choice and of almost exclusivity to the Israeli government, it has affected how the United States is viewed throughout the world, and this disinformation is still wide. If there was a strategic requirement, wouldn't this fall as one? In other words, are you only able to work with long-term contracts, or if we reauthorize you, are you prepared to deal in real time with information that once spread cannot, the genie can't be put back in the bottle once people have this view?
I can't rule out that the Global Engagement Center could take a more active posture. You're right, it would be very resource intensive. In general, we are not engaged in back and forth in the online environment in real time. That's never been the operational posture of the Global Engagement Center. When I say strategic, I'm talking about things like our Russia report or the exposure of the Belt and Road Initiative.
And I appreciate that, and I certainly would appreciate if every time we can show that Belt and Road was gotten by bribes and ultimately delivered an inferior product, that's helpful. But in 2020 and 2021, you spent hundreds of thousands of dollars producing a video game related to disinformation. Would it surprise you that they didn't? That video game that you paid for did not go after Xi or Putin or Iran, but in fact after citizens of the U.S., maybe not intended, but after citizens of the U.S. that spoke of waste, fraud, and abuse within our own country?
So the video game that we supported is a neutral teaching tool. It's not directed at any environment. It simply shows people how campaigns can be constructed. It's intended to raise awareness. It doesn't have any political significance. That's not the way it
But I thought we weren't paying for neutral. We were paying for results that drove down disinformation. Did it do that?
So we did have a peer-reviewed study of the video game, one of the games, and Harmony Square, and it recorded a 23% increase in people's ability to spot disinformation after using the game. So that part was not neutral, and that is why we funded it.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. I'd be curious to know, would that change 23%, but how many people played the game? Maybe they changed their minds, but how many people did it actually reach? Going to yield to Ms. Dean now for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member, and I thank you, Mr. Kimmage, for your work, the work of your department, and for your testimony today in clearing up certain things. I'll go back to Hamas, if I may. We watched in horror and sadness at the brutal attack, barbaric attack, October the 7th, and the hours and days after that, as they unfolded in Israel, and of course from Gaza. Relevant to today's hearing, we also watched confusion. Some of it was just discussed among my colleagues. As you note in your testimony, and I quote, "Control over the narrative is of key importance between Israel and Hamas." So I'd like to try to examine what you mean by that, because I think you're right. The story, the narrative, and the facts and truth about that matter. And you know better than I, but disinformation appears to be everywhere. In the lead up to October the 7th, what was your office, your department seeing in terms of disinformation around what would be this brutal attack? Disinformation by Hamas in Gaza, West Bank, wherever disinformation was taking place. What do you know about the lead up? And I understand you're not of the moment reporters, but how about disinformation around evacuation orders? We talked about disinformation around the hospital attack and maybe disinformation going on. Can you give us any sense of what your office saw?
Sure. Our focus here is in keeping with our main lines of effort, and those are to analyze, to coordinate, and then to work with partners. And we have tracked broadly the efforts by extremist groups to promote their narrative, to turn every situation to their advantage. In this conflict, we have leveraged that in the following ways. We have conducted daily analysis, and on the narrative front, we are particularly vigilant for attempts by the major malign actors to pile on to the conflict and turn it to their advantage. So we are looking at not just the narratives that Hamas is promoting, but how Iran is then amplifying those further, how Russia is in many cases then amplifying those even more, and then how the PRC is integrating this into their global efforts. So we are very focused on that aspect of the narrative. Bear in mind, our model is an adversary-based model. It is a threat actor model. So we don't look at the totality of information flow. We really start with the threat actors, and that's because we have limited bandwidth and resources.
And if I could ask you to paint the picture a little bit, I do love the barstool analogy. I'm stealing that, Ranking Member. How do you make it plain? What was it that GEC was hearing, seeing, being proliferated in terms of disinformation?
So in terms of disinformation, what we have seen is Iran amplifying Hamas's narrative more or less lock, stock, and barrel. What we have seen is Russia making limited opportunistic attempts to advance particular disinformation narratives about weapons, et cetera. They've tried to draw a link between weapons we provided to Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East. That's a very classic, so far limited, but Russian approach.
If I could just take you back, I appreciate what amplification took place by other malign actors, larger ones. What did Hamas put out?
Hamas has put out an avalanche of propaganda claiming falsely to be the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. They are not. And we have, of course, tracked that, and we've tracked the amplification of that, primarily by Iran, but also by others.
And what did they say about Israel in their propaganda?
Which
Hamas.
Hamas denies the legitimacy of Israel's right to exist.
Yeah. And the disinformation that continues, of course, now during this conflict. Is there anything kind of granular that you can say in this setting that is going on?
What I would say in this setting is that we must be vigilant to attempts by our adversaries to link this into a global narrative, and we must be aware of the enormous resources that they bring to bear. This is everything from television stations like the Arabic language Al-Alam that Iran has, to Russia Today in Arabic, to the global media properties of the PRC, all the way down through troll farms and cyber tools. This is an enormous global propaganda apparatus. It is one that seeks to turn every event into a blame America first incident where they can turn it to their advantage. And so we are tracking that, and we are leveraging everything we can to push back against it.
Well, it seems like the folks in your office and GEC must feel like they're in a blizzard of disinformation, and we have to do everything we can to support you and your work. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. I appreciate the line of questioning. I would caution, perhaps, not to necessarily make policy exactly, whether Hamas does or does not represent the Palestinian people. I know we had Erdogan just say that he called them a liberation group. So I think he's a pretty good representation of a lot of the sentiment of the Arabic world, unfortunately. And his characterization of them doesn't make them seem so strictly as an enemy of the Palestinian people. So I'd caution you in your policy making. I'm now going to yield to Mr. Kim for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kimmage, for joining us. Actually, I want to pick up where you kind of left off. I thought you made a very strong and compelling, vivid picture about this enormous propaganda machine that we're facing here. So I guess I just kind of start to you, like, are we scaled to the magnitude that we need to be to counter that? I mean, that certainly sounded very formidable.
So we also bring formidable capabilities to the table. They are not resourced to the extent that our adversaries are investing in this. We do have international broadcasting. We have our colleagues in the public diplomacy enterprise who are working hard. We have the Department of Defense. We have our intelligence community, and we have our partners and allies. So we do have all those things. I'm clear-eyed about the enormous investment that our adversaries have made, but I would like to draw attention to recent efforts that we've made to make our allies and partners more resilient. We talked about the offensive part of our mission, the exposures, the reports. I'd like to talk a little bit about the defensive part, because this is what will eventually undermine our adversaries' investment. We've recently signed memoranda of understanding with North Macedonia, with Bulgaria, with Moldova on principles that we believe will make all countries more resilient. These are having a national strategy to deal with information manipulation, having specific structures and institutions like the Global Engagement Center, having the capability to see what's happening in the information environment, to see what our adversaries are doing, to have vibrant civil society and media to expose and shine light on information manipulation, and then to have multilateral engagement on this. And this is maybe less eye-catching and glamorous than some things, but it is the necessary work of diplomacy that the State Department does every day to make us and others more resilient. And that will help to counter some of this enormous investment that our adversaries are making in lives and fault.
And I appreciate you raising that, because that was something I wanted to get to, is just that the idea of coalition building. So it sounds like in your mind here, again, we're up against this very large propaganda machine, but it's not just on us, that we're able to leverage and have coalition partners that can be a force multiplier. Is that kind of along the lines of what you're saying?
Absolutely. I would take from the counterterrorism world, the Global Engagement Center has co-led one of the lines of effort, the communications line of effort in the counter-ISIS coalition for several years. That coalition, which I've been privileged to be involved with, has made significant strides countering ISIS, and particularly ISIS propaganda. And we are trying to leverage some of that experience in the different but related task of countering the information manipulation by nation states.
Well, now, I wanted to get in, you talked about this increase in alignment, not necessarily direct coordination, but a kind of alignment between some of these actors, Russia, Iran, China in particular. You talk about how their efforts to try to shape disinformation and promote that here in the United States, to try to sow doubt and challenges here amongst Americans. What is our capability? How would you assess our capability of getting information to the people in those nations? There are countries that have very strong control over their own media. When we think about the fight going on in Ukraine, I always kind of wonder, like, how much are the Russian people understanding about some of this, or are they understanding that there's a lot of different sides to it that they're not getting fed?
You cite probably our greatest challenge, which is reaching audiences in the PRC in Russia. The propaganda and disinformation efforts of these nations are primarily directed against their own populations. They have reinstituted types of control that we haven't seen since the Soviet Union. It is a huge challenge. We have what I would describe as modest efforts to reach Russian-speaking audiences. We do work to support independent media that are doing tremendous work to show the truth of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, to show the true cost it's inflicting on the Russian people. So it is an enormous challenge. We are working, and we will be trying to do more.
Thank you. And look, I just sort of say that to my colleagues here on this committee. I think that's something that we should be very thoughtful about. When we think about this disinformation, certainly the defense part of it is important, but on the offensive side, if we're not able to have that kind of penetration, if we're not able to, but they are having tremendous penetration with our own country, there's something there that we need to be thinking about, and I hope that that's something we can work on in a bipartisan way. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. We're going to do another round of questioning here for anybody that wants to, Ms. Dean or Mr. Kim. And I'm going to touch off on something that my colleague, Mr. Issa, was talking about anecdotally. He was bringing up one of the third parties that you used. And to paint the picture, they labeled risky and non-risky entities. whatever the time frame was. And they said risky, top 10 risky, New York Post, Real Clear Politics, The Blaze, One American News, Newsmax, The Federalist, The Daily Wire. Those are the most risky. And the most trustworthy, or the not risky, were NPR, Associated Press, New York Times, Huffington Post. Other ones, Wall Street Journal, and the list goes on. But some in that list of not risky I consider to be highly risky. And so my question goes to third parties in general. I want to know if there's an institutional bias for third parties that are hired to do this work, because that, as one example, seems like an institution that has a bias. And it's almost like being double-crossed, because they did get our money, and then it was saying this is risky, this is not risky, but the ones they said were not risky were the ones in real time perpetuating the hospital lie, as an example. I'm not going to go through other examples, but as an example, they were the ones perpetuating that hospital lie. And so a couple of questions there, and that's where I go back to, one, I want a list of the third parties that you've been out there hiring, because I want to know if institutionally biased third parties are being hired by you all. And number two, and I know this is soon after, but do you know for a fact at this point that any of your other third parties that we don't have a list of yet were a part of spreading the hospital lie or have an anti-Israel bias?
So on our partners, we will never have control over what they do in the future. Just to be absolutely clear, the work that you're referring to.
I will acknowledge that. You don't have control over your third-party partners. They're third party. I understand why you're using them, not to be mean. People aren't following your Twitter. You're looking for people of influence to do this. But do you know if any of the third parties to date that you've hired were part of the hospital lie? We'll call it that.
So let me just answer your preceding question on bias. We have a process to select partners. We have an open announcement asking for the type of work. We have a panel that reviews the partners, and in every statement of work, in every agreement that we make with them, and let me read this for the record, we have the following, which says, GEC does not address United States domestic audiences, nor engage in domestic discussions of United States policy. No activities supported under this scope of work shall be directed toward U.S. persons. Any such engagement, if determined by GEC to have been intentional, may constitute grounds for termination for cause of this award. That is in every agreement that we make with a third party. So that is as set in stone as it can be. And I just wanted to make sure that you and other members of the committee hear that, to allay any concerns that you might have.
Yeah, just say this, the mission statement is to counter foreign state, non-state propaganda, disinformation efforts that threaten the stability of the United States, its allies, and partner nations. So that's a tough mix there, because you're not supposed to address Americans. You are addressing across the globe, and obviously one of our allies being Israel, partner nation being Israel. So just again, to that very pointed question, do you know yet at this point any of your current third parties under contract were part of spreading the Al-Ali hospital lie with the rest of the Palestinians?
I'm not aware of any of our partners.
Do you plan on investigating whether they were a part of spreading that lie about our ally?
We will look into this and get back to you.
I hope you do, and I will look forward to you getting back. I now yield to my friend, Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we talk just for a moment about the nature of risk when you're doing innovative things and in a very dynamic space where you're trying to stay up to speed with an evolving environment? Because it seems like you could be risk averse to the point of being irrelevant. But if you take no risk, if you're not innovating, if you're not experimenting with things, then you're actually not staying ahead of a rapidly evolving environment. So how do you address that, right? There's no situation in which a relevant entity that exists within a dynamic environment is accomplishing its purpose without taking some risk and trying things. And some of those things will work and some of them won't. So just talk to me about your approach on that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. This is a persistent and unavoidable aspect of operating in the communication space. When we work with partners, we gain credibility, we gain flexibility, sometimes we gain rapidity, but there is a trade-off in terms of control. A partner is not going to vet their messaging through the rigorous clearance process at the State Department to ensure that it's fully in line with all of those requirements. So there is a trade-off there. There is always risk in the space. There is also a risk in inaction. That is not perfectly safe. The risk in inaction is that our adversaries are going to be doing everything they can to undermine us in the communications space. To answer your specific question, we weigh this on a case-by-case basis. We do this when we review partners. We do this when we make decisions about what we will and we won't do. It's a huge challenge. We're always keenly aware that we can't do nothing. Our mandate compels us to take on this mission, and we are keenly aware that there are many eyes on us, that there are risks in the space, and I don't know what more I can say beyond the fact that it is one of the more onerous and challenging parts of our job.
And is it your opinion, as somebody who's operated in this space for a very long time and seen how it's changed, that the risk of inaction is much higher than the risk of action, even if sometimes that action misses the mark or isn't exactly the way it works and you have to adapt?
Broadly speaking, I would agree. We are seeing an increasing, not just tempo of operations by our adversaries, but this alignment that I've referred to several times. And so we can't afford to look the other way. We can't afford to be mired in internal rumination. We do have to act, and we do have to execute the mission that you and your colleagues have given us.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. So I wanted to ask a couple of additional questions. You know, prior to 2017, when the GEC was created, what was actually the mechanism that was used? And if that was sufficient, what types of duplications of effort would GEC actually have, or what makes GEC so special?
Sure. With the caveat that I was working on specific counterterrorism issues before 20.
And where was that with, my apologies, for the counterterrorism
Sure.
CT operations?
Yeah, I was the principal deputy of the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, and in 2016 I was in the Office of Policy Planning, so I was not as directly involved. To my knowledge, there was no entity in the executive branch that had the ability to convene the interagency, that was specifically tasked with doing the work that the Global Engagement Center does. And I can only point you to the relative absence of reports like the reports that we've done on Russia, the PRC in particular, and other topics before 2017 when the GEC was created.
So one of the things that you guys do is that you look and assess third-party violations of these types of propaganda and misinformation campaigns that are going on. And some of those that can be listed are social media organizations like VK as an example and things like this. Why wouldn't we list TikTok, a foreign-created social media platform that's being utilized for these types of propaganda and misinformation campaigns, as a violator assessed by GEC?
Sure. So just to clarify, the Global Engagement Center doesn't have any regulatory role. We don't assess social media.
But you do actually go in and review those who are actually kind of misrepresenting things so that we know exactly how to identify and then counter, correct?
What we do is we identify the tools in the toolbox that our adversaries use for information manipulation. And in fact, we have sponsored work that shows how TikTok is being used by the PRC. What we don't do is anything in the regulatory space. We don't either recommend.
But you do see that TikTok is in fact being utilized in this manner to be pushed by the PRC as a mechanism to have a cultural impact by utilizing misinformation and propaganda.
We have, I believe, supported report that highlights the role that TikTok plays in the PRC's effort to reshape the global media environment. Yes.
And, you know, it's interesting, going along that thread, knowing this, would you advise, or would you, coming from a policy background, obviously, there are bills that the Republicans are putting forward where they would want to ban TikTok. Now, I'm not asking you to say that this is a policy that you thereby would create, but do you think that that should be something which is effective in trying to tamp down some of the utilization of TikTok as this mechanism?
The GC and I don't take any position on regulatory matters. I can only reiterate that TikTok is one of the tools in the toolbox in the PRC's broader effort to reshape the global.
So I'll take that as a yes, that if we were to get rid of that, that limits the toolbox and what they're actually able to utilize. Your office's mission is to direct, lead, synchronize, integrate, and coordinate U.S. federal government efforts to recognize, understand, expose, and counter foreign state and non-state propaganda. Are there other offices that you're aware of within any other U.S. agency that you can identify that monitors, exposes, or counters this misinformation?
So we work with many partners that do parts of this, but we're the ones who do this sort of exclusively because that's our congressional mandate. We work with partners in the intelligence community who look at adversarial information manipulation. We work with partners who look at the broader information environment.
So there's others that do this. So there is potentially then, and I apologize for interrupting, but there is then potentially redundancies, because I know that I sit on the Armed Services Committee as well, and I sit on the Intelligence Special Operations Subcommittee, and I won't talk about anything which is classified in this unclassified setting, but we know that there's other areas who do exactly the same thing in a very similar manner. Does that not create a redundancy in some ways?
I don't believe that there are redundancies. We work with partners that, you know, the information environment's dynamic and it touches on almost every aspect of our existence. So we don't duplicate the work that our colleagues in the intelligence community do. We don't duplicate the work that our colleagues in international broadcasting do. They complement our work, and we try to complement theirs, but I would argue that it's not a redundancy, and we don't duplicate each other's work.
Well, I certainly look at working with your office and making sure that we can continue these discussions to look at exactly what it is that we're funding and what the benefits of this is in a way that would stop the PRC and other adversarial nations from utilizing platforms, as we've discussed, to help to be weaponized in their misinformation campaigns. But again, I go back to my original thing, which is that it all starts within the U.S. government and the messaging and the actual foreign policy that we're promoting that's being utilized against us, because we are making the mistakes of not considering Iran to be the largest state sponsor of terror and not calling them out for that. We are making mistakes when we don't immediately identify that Iran plays a role with Hamas, and we are making a mistake when we don't look at China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as adversarial nations as opposed to competitors, and then we start abandoning our Americans behind. So it's our own foreign policy, in my opinion, and our own actions that give credence and actually support exactly what is being spun around and used against us. And I think that it starts a good, strong foreign policy, and that will help us to control the narratives that we put forward. With that, I yield back. Sir, do you have anything for you?
I don't think you want to yield to me. You're the chairman.
I'll be happy to let you ask more questions if you want to go a second.
I'm
third,
good.
fourth.
I'm ready to go to closing if you are, Chairman.
All right, sounds good. Want to give you the opportunity. I mean, come on. Got to make sure that my 325th or 82nd buddy has something. I thank the witness for the valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The member of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for record, subject to the link of limitations, without objection.
Yeah, and I
will
just want to
refer
make
to
sure
you,
you're
Mr.
not going
Crow.
to adjourn.
Mr.
Yeah.
Crow.
Okay.
The committee will refer to you, Mr. Crow, as the ranking member.
Okay. Thank you.
closing
Thank you,
statement.
Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Kimmage, for your testimony here today and your insights into the Global Engagement Center and for your many years of service to the country. Your testimony has put into sharp focus the critical work of the Global Engagement Center and how you and your team work tirelessly every day to counter misinformation and disinformation by our adversaries, that it goes to the core of our national security, as well as our proactive efforts to develop alliances and partnerships to spread democracy and freedom throughout the world. You talked about the risks of inaction, which in my view are unacceptable risks, and that's why we have to continue to innovate, to create, to engage, and that's obviously what you do, as the name of your center implies. You also operate in the open, and you're transparent, because I've always thought that if we lead with our values, if we lead by being open and transparent and with our partnerships, that ultimately people will see that, as difficult and challenging as that might be in this environment. There is really no other way. Your work is critical, and in my view, Congress should work with you to reauthorize the important work of the Global Engagement Center, to give you the resources, to work with you to give you the resources that you need to counter disinformation and misinformation by our adversaries. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to make sure that we do reauthorize this, that we conduct our oversight. We will always do that. Make sure that we're asking tough questions and that we're being good stewards of the taxpayer dollar and we're accomplishing the congressionally mandated mission. But I do look forward to working with you, and I think it's extremely important that we support your work. And with that, I yield back.
I want to thank the ranking member once again and our witness. Again, we will be in touch to make sure that we can look at how your office will truly serve its purpose and whether or not the reauthorization is necessary with regards to overarching redundancies across various agencies. With that, I'll consider this to be adjourned.